It's time to grade free agency, John. It's time. We've had a week of free agency, and free agency's been dead for the big boys for about a week. So, like, the stuff that was going to happen, happened. Dalton Schultz out there, we'll see if he gets a contract.
What do they say? A bird in the hand is better than some birds in the bush. Some of these guys thought the birds would be flying
Free
to
in the
them.
bush.
I would argue that if you didn't strike while the iron was hot Monday, Tuesday, because by Wednesday, the deals just had happened, the previous two deals, when it became official.
Yeah, three in the bush, I think. Isn't it three?
I think it's two, but I would say with the inflated inflation, higher salary cap, you could do three, maybe three, and like another animal in there in the bush as well.
All right, let's start, and then we can go to other things. I saw today Peter King in his Football Morning in America gave 1 week free agency report cards. His number one ranked team was the Bears because of their trade with the Panthers, and the 49ers were number two because of their week, but also, I mean, based mostly on the belief that they got maybe the most talented available player in free agency.
Yeah, I think last year.
So we'd have to say that's their biggest positive, is my point.
I would say by far the biggest positive is that it was shocking a week. We're recording this a week later, that on Monday, when it was announced that they had signed a massive deal, and $40 million guaranteed was one of the bigger guarantees given out to a true free agent. Only McGlinchey was a little higher. Not only got a stud, but a position of need. I mean, the defensive tackle position was a problem. I saw Barros, I was reading some of our boys' work, and they had 4 less sacks this year. Like, obviously, their defensive line, I think, is held in high regard around the NFL. Like, not even fans. I'm just saying, when NFL players, NFL coaches talk Niners, the first thing they say, defensive line, pass rush. 4 less sacks this year than they had on their Super Bowl team, and obviously there's an extra game. So while it's really good, little inflated, Bosa gets as dramatically improved, right? What he ended up with, 16, 17 sacks. Then they get these random guys off the other edge, but interior pass rush, Armstead, he was not really around, right? He was injured the majority of the season. Kinlaw was just a negative. I mean, he's just injured and disappears as well, and is not any good when he's actually on the field. So to get a guy who is not just an impact player, 11 sacks for, I saw New Heights, Jason Kelce called the Niners a rival, in the sense of, like, kind of what he was saying is, like, we're the two best teams and we're going to play next year. It's kind of just going to be a rivalry moving forward. I'd argue it's a double whammy. You get a stud and you remove it from a team, which, let's face it, you're kind of chasing now.
That's true. That's true. Now,
because
it was a 16-game schedule, by the way, so it was the same number of games, right?
What do you mean?
Did they have a first-round bye? You said they had 4 less sacks than they did the Super Bowl year. Was that your stat?
Yeah, but my point, I'm talking about during the regular season. So, like,
gotcha. Okay,
there was an extra 17th game.
Gotcha. I thought you were counting the Super Bowl as the extra game.
I think in a perfect world, it's weird because they play different positions. But, like, the Eagles, is Hargrave better than Slay, Bradbury combined? When you factor in they got a 10th pick, they could draft a corner. They kind of had to do, like, put the pieces of the puzzle together on their roster, but by no means did they, like, he just got out of their price range, but they did really value, like, he was one of their better players, right, on a powerhouse team.
I think the other thing with him that really makes Javon Hargrave a fit and it makes it a win is he perfectly fits your team's identity. I said it last week when we talked about him. I was quoting what you've said for years, as long as you've been in the media game since your scouting career ended with the Eagles, and that is, everyone has to understand that free agency is not plug and play. And so I think it's not just that they got this really talented player, and then also the thing you added, they took him from one of their rivals or maybe their main rival, but that he fits exactly what their identity is. They've been from the beginning. They've been a roller coaster team, but one thing they've always been is what they said they were going to be, which is a team built from the middle up, or from the defensive line back. And he fits their identity perfectly. So there's not a lot of wonder about whether or not he'll fit in. I think you feel pretty confident that he is a free agent that you don't have to wait and see kind of what you're going to get from him. And we know why he's gone too, right? Philly, even though they just brought Slay back, they just had so many good players available. They couldn't keep all of them. It wasn't like why did Amari Cooper get traded from the Cowboys? Well, Cowboys can't afford him, and he doesn't really fit their locker room, right? It was they would have kept him if they could have, but they couldn't, so they didn't.
There was also a variable with the Eagles where when you talk about two of their defensive linemen that they're returning, Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham, there's a little legacy element, right? Like for them, it'd be the equivalent of like a Joe Staley. If Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman, probably more Willis than Bowman, would have had a longer career. Like it's hard to get rid of guys that have been elite, that you drafted, that are homegrown, and they re-sign those guys. Like the 49ers salary cap hit on Hargrave this year is pretty small. I think it's like $5 or $6 million. So it's not like the cap number they couldn't have manipulated like the 49ers did. But if they did, they would have had to say bye to Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox, which I think they couldn't do that quite yet, given that they just had a lot of success, because ultimately those are their guys. Not that Hargrave isn't, because he's a better player than those two guys combined, really. I mean, Brandon Graham's a backup now, and Fletcher is, I don't want to say a shell of himself, but he's not nearly as good. Like, if he was a free agent, he wasn't getting, Javon Hargrave over.
Yeah.
Javon Hargrave, I saw.
Javon. I saw that on his Football Reference the day he signed, and I'm like, I don't always trust that page, but Javon Hargrave.
His nickname is Gravedigger.
Gravedigger. Great nickname.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Gravedigger's a big is Gravedigger still a monster truck? That was a monster truck
Has
when we
to
were
be.
kids.
I mean, yeah.
Why would you ever change it? It's not like an athlete that ages out and has to retire. I just keep putting the thing on at Arco. Niners still need a kicker. Niners losing their right tackle was celebrated, but they still need a right tackle, but they saved money. I guess you could argue. We'll see. But I'll stick with positive. Sorry. Sam Darnold. I don't know if that's the second biggest positive, but it's a positive. They got to Josh Johnson last year, and it was not close to good enough in their most important game of the year. So even if we talk about Sam in the least dramatic way possible and say he's your third quarterback, it's still, they got better at a position that turned out to be a critical position for them last year, and is the most critical position on a team with two quarterbacks returning who are coming off injuries.
Yeah, I would say the identity of Kyle Shanahan, first and foremost, has been the investment in the line of scrimmage. And I would say right behind that is just having a lot of bullets in his gun at the quarterback position. I mean, think about last year. They drafted a quarterback, which paid massive dividends when Jimmy Garoppolo went down. Without Brock Purdy, who knows? They could have easily been in a situation where it's a Matt McGloin, it's a, some random guy that you just lose with. And they invested that position. He earned his way to beat a guy out. And I think they doubled down on doing that again, because one thing that was out of their control was the Purdy injury. News turned out pretty good, right? It could have easily gone, he needs the whole thing. He's probably going to be gone for the season. Instead, it was brace, should be able to play, right? We don't know exact date, and we won't know until really he starts throwing. And even then, it's like, can he throw for 3 weeks straight, or is it getting sore, or is it getting swollen? Like, there are definitely hurdles to climb. But I think the Darnold thing is like a double whammy, because we've talked about this. It creates competition. But two, like, Trey does get to start the offseason. If Purdy was healthy, he wouldn't have been able to do it, just getting the main reps while being pushed with a guy who has a lot of experience, who's a high-level guy, who, you said you watched before we hopped on here, the press conference, like, high character, well-liked, just kind of that LA kind of easygoing. He's kind of got the unique kind of Leinart Sanchez vibe, going, which Sanchez, I know people that worked on teams when he started bouncing around, like, beloved teammate.
Yeah, comfortable. I would say comfortable in their skin is how I would describe all three of them.
Did you see when Sam was walking around the Niners facility with Hargrave and Farrell? He had on like the Van shoes. It's just the classic, like, it was Newport, San Diego look. So he plays into it. And the other thing is, Guy, I do believe, I'm not saying that they can strike oil with them, but if you told me Sam Darnold, who clearly had the best stretch of his career, the end of Carolina, who is now comfortable because Steve Wilkes, a guy that he was singing his praises in that press conference, right? He knows Christian well. So he comes into an environment where he knows the main coach, the defensive coordinator, knows one of the star players, and then comes to a place where I think kind of deep down they kind of like this, taking projects in a weird way. I mean, I think ideally they'd love their Mahomes or Allen, but clearly that's fucking not happening.
Yeah.
So they'll take the next best thing is making Purdy into a stud, making Sam Darnold resurrect his career. So he's got a hell of an opportunity, man.
Yeah,
and he was cheap.
He seems like a cheap and a willing learner, I would say, watching his press conference. Knows how to say all the right things, knows how to handle. I think one maybe quality about Darnold we didn't talk about last week. He has now, in a short amount of time, kind of had several different NFL experiences. He's been the golden child savior. He's been the we don't want him anymore, kick him to the curb, back a cut quarterback, he's been a hurt quarterback. He's been a highly criticized quarterback. He's been an invested in, traded for quarterback. He's been a cast aside quarterback again. So in a room that Trey and Brock are not controversial, but their situation has the potential to be controversial. You've got a guy who's been in some pretty controversial, like the Jets thing is pretty controversial, just being a Jets quarterback, and he's an uncontroversial person. I think that also makes him a very good fit.
I don't know who said this. I think it was like one of those Instagram accounts, like leadership/wealth or whatever, and it's always like, an Elon or
Ed. What's the guy's name? Ed
Milet.
Milet. Yeah,
yeah. It's just I love Ed. That it was either Bezos or Elon, and they say it's one of those like, what's the first question you ask when you're interviewing someone?
Yeah,
it might have been Bezos, and it says, tell me a time when in a professional situation when shit hit the fan, or like you handled serious adversity. And it kind of made, like, most people, if you get to the point where you're interviewing with a boss or you're interviewing in the NFL or whatever, like, you got there for a reason. But like, if you really want to get to know someone, like, what did you do when the radio station threw you to the curb? How did you find a way to keep food on the table? You and I can say that, but there's a lot of people that if life goes pretty well, it doesn't matter if, like, regardless who you are, you can go a long period of time without kind of like going through some rough seas. And it's going through rough seas and going through tough times, whether you're a quarterback, whether you run a small business, whether you're just a couple podcasters, I do think it kind of wake you up a little bit and just kind of put you in and help you grow. And that's one thing that the 49ers quarterback room, I'd say, all has. Trey, a lot of adversity early. Injuries, not playing. People think he sucks. Darnold, we've just hit on it. Purdy, was the last pick in the draft, gets to start, becomes a stud, boom, elbow ripped. And even, didn't you say that he said after the season that, like, I got to kind of practice what I preach now. I say I'm this tough mentally SOB. I better handle it pretty well.
Yep. It was a really great line by him. So they're all in a similar boat in their own different ways. And Sam, the other thing is Sam has been in that boat that these two guys are in, trying to prove themselves. And if he's what he says he is, he's there to help them. I mean, he's there to help the team win. That's what he repeated. While we're talking, we can talk offensive line. The 49ers have signed John Feliciano. It's not just the chat that's telling it. John, I've confirmed it on other parts of the internet. Sometimes the chat is like a fake Schefter, but this time the chat is right. Chance here on the chat quotes a story. Feliciano played a career high 971 snaps last year. I actually had him at more, while amassing a healthy 97.6 pass blocking efficiency rating per PFF. He also had the fewest sacks allowed. I have him on PFF as the third fewest, but whichever. I've got him at over 1,000 snaps. This number, did that say over 1,000? 971. I had him over 1,000 snaps, but whatever. So offensive line depth, kind of the
maybe they factor in like field goal in some of those.
Could be. I also this has him at center last year. See Philly. Sorry, at 1,095 snaps at center last year. But he can also play guard.
What team was he on last year? The Cowboys?
Giants.
Giants.
Yeah. The Niners have invested. They've got about $35 million invested in their starting offensive line. 7 of it in Trent Williams, and about 8 in the other 4 spots. Banks, Brendel, Burford, and let's say McKivitz right now. So, everyone kind of got what they wanted in a change at right tackle, but the question now is, how does this line fit together?
But see, I think that's a good signing. I like signings like the second week of free agency. One, they never cost much money. And 2, you can just get good role players. I think you see it a lot with when you sign Trent Sherfield signed today with the Bills. Like Trent Sherfield is an NFL player on your NFL roster that doesn't cost you that much that you do not sign Wednesday or Thursday of free agency, right? But you immediately do, for $1.8 million or $1.5 million. You lose Brunskill. One thing that's hard in like the scouting community is it's easy to have like a Trent Williams or Lane Johnson or, whoever the star center is, Jason Kelsey. Well, that guy at any moment can shatter his leg or pull his hammy or miss a game. So you have to have a guy, usually multiple offensive linemen, one a tackle. Your backup tackle has to be able to play left and right. Or one of your tackles that starts has to be able to swing. And ideally, your backup tackle to keep him on the roster has to be able to swing. And I would say your backup guard/center has to be able to do it both. One thing Daniel Brunskill had, he was a pretty unreal backup. Because at any moment he could start, and you could win with him as a starter, and he was perfectly suited to be a backup. So those guys, listen, you say the most boring thing on draft night is drafting an offensive lineman high, and it's true. Now, once that guy becomes Trent Williams or Lane Johnson or whatever, it's sweet. But at the time, like Joe Staley from Central Michigan isn't as fun until 4 years later he makes a Pro Bowl. And you're like, God, that was a hell of a pick. But the backup offensive linemen are easily probably the most boring guys on the team. They are viewed in a front office with any coach, especially Kyle, who's the offensive play caller, as fucking very valuable. So that type move, like losing Brunskill's, it's not going to be a headliner like a Hargrave or, McGlinchey getting $50 million. Like that was a sneaky, pretty big 49er story that no one's going to spend more than 5 minutes talking about beside the 49ers internally.
Yep.
One
Feliciano
thing
played 1,000. So just his center, John, last year. The year before in Buffalo with Daboll, he played a lot of left guard and some right guard. The year before that with Daboll, he played mostly right guard and some center and some left guard. The year before that, he played a ton of right guard and some center. So he's played all 3 interior offensive line positions.
Played for a lot of winning teams, I feel like. Didn't he play
3 years in Buffalo and 4 years with the Raiders. So
but remember when he was on the Raiders, a couple of those good Jack Del Rio, like the one Jack Del Rio team that made the playoffs, and that would have been 16.
Yeah.
Derek's kind of breakout year with when their offensive line was at the time viewed as one of the better in the league, right? With like Donald Penn, him, Gabe Jackson.
Who's the other
what's
big
his
guy?
Name? Mississippi State guy. It was a pretty good player. I forget his name.
Who went to the Cardinals? Was that Gabe? Or is the guy we're trying to think of?
No, Rodney Hudson.
Yeah, Rodney Hudson.
So now I don't know. I don't even know if he was a full-time starter on that team. But
what year was that team?
That would have been 16.
Feliciano played 47 snaps on offense that year.
So he wasn't a full-time starter, but you bring value. One positive, free agency, when you really look at the names that signed, Hargrave, I think most people would agree with Peter King or whoever in the media that's writing it, was the best player if you just remove age and whatever, just pure on tape, most dominant player that every team in the league would want if you didn't have to factor in, I don't have the money to sign him. That's not an ideal. Like free agency is usually led by Aaron Judge's, Kevin Durant's, Peyton Manning's. I mean,
yeah.
Right? So the free agency class sucked, but the 49ers threw out guys throughout the league that got an astronomical amount of money. And as we saw last year, they are headed for comp picks separate from Rand getting a job and, the Washington coach getting a job and Mike McDaniel getting a job. Just their players getting paid. McGlinchey and Jimmy combined for almost $90 million in guaranteed cash. Mosley got $6 million. Alshire got, I think, $7 or $8 million guaranteed. They had guys spread throughout the league get cash, which is going to yield them picks.
I don't know what Jordan Willis got. That number hasn't been Reported today, John, but he signed with the Raiders today.
Both their pass rushers, right? Amenahu and whoever the dude is that signed with the Chiefs.
Ebukam?
Ebukam. They both got paid some cash.
What was Alshire's number? Wasn't huge. Was it like 6?
No, I thought I saw 6 or I thought I saw 7 maybe. But it all adds up.
We're waiting on Robbie Gould's $6 million contract somewhere too.
Yeah, we'll keep waiting there, Rob.
Did you say?
But I would say that the two things that really helped the 49ers is McGlinchey's number was astronomical.
Yep.
I mean, astronomical. Because if McGlinchey does not exist, we're not talking about this. That thing immediately starts them on like rounding second. Then you just add, they had a mid-tier quarterback, not a great quarterback, but a guy get $35 million guaranteed. Look how many guys that signed, good players, the safety, Jesse Bates that went to the Falcons, these random guys that sign all over the league. Most people are not getting $35 million guaranteed. So Jimmy's number, and it's not, it's a 3 or 68 whatever $1 million contract. So that the numbers on those two guys alone are two of the bigger contracts given out in free agency.
I heard maybe it was Jeff Howe said, like, because Peter King's argument was there's kind of a middle class in NFL quarterback free agency this year with Jimmy and Geno, where they're usually the last few years there has not been a middle class. There's been $8 million guys, and then everyone else gets 40,
30 plus,
yeah, something insane. And he was making the point, like, even if you're Jimmy and you've made more money, you still just signed for $35 million guaranteed. That's, even for a rich guy, that's a massive chunk of change.
And if he finds a way to stay healthy and he's the starter, let's just say for the next 2 years, we say this all the time about quarterback, that number is actually probably more like he's going to make $45 million in 2 years.
Give me another win or a loss, positive or negative, from Niners free agency.
I would say one thing going with the negatives is they just lost a lot of players that have helped them win big games over the years.
Jimmy Ward. I
mean, think how many times over the years on a Monday night game 2 years ago with the season on the line against the Rams and Jimmy Ward to make it 14-0, pick sixes that ball, and it was like the route's on. How many times Jimmy Ward just made plays, big tackles, just was a solid starter for them. Say what you want about Alshire. The other two guys, I mean, Fred separated himself a long time ago, and Greenlaw separated himself this year. When Alshire, whose video guy is fucking incredible, go to his Instagram account, he has some pretty sweet highlights of some big picks, some big tackles. Like that guy just, the difference of Alshire to me and Flanagan Fowles, who they didn't even tender, and just the other names, not name the top guys, is a pretty big gap. Yeah, I mean, Alshire's a legitimate NFL player. Now, ideal starter, we could argue that, but like, if that's your third linebacker, holy shit.
Yeah. Just the level of play maybe drops off a hair. The level of physicality did not drop off with him. I think, the speed, just the tone that the starter set, that did not drop off when you went to Azeez Alshire. And he was a guy that they kind of found. I just always, when I think about the last few years of going to Niners practice, one image that always sticks in my head is those three linebackers, just the three of them, Alshire, Greenlaw, and Fred Warner, were their own little pod. Like they did their own little thing. The other linebackers would be off doing drills or doing whatever else they did. And it would be those three guys and only those three guys spending a lot of time together. So Alshire was much closer to their equal than like the equal of the next linebacker on the depth chart, right? And you just broke, that little group had to break up. That little group just kind of, there have been position groups over the years on every team where they're a little group. And that group of three linebackers, only two of them would play at the same time, but that group of three just broke up with Alshire. And Jimmy, is Jimmy the last? No, Jimmy's not the last bulky draft pick, right? Armstead,
yeah. I think one of the last. I think it's him, those two.
Yeah. And the other, like you mentioned, Jimmy Ward, I'd say just the safety group is a little less deep, it feels like. Now, last year they found Gibson, and that was great, right? That worked out better than anyone could have imagined. Hufanga turned out to be a major hit for them. Odom. But it's that I would say I'd put that on my question marks. Just Are they going to get through? Is it just going to work again, Gibson and Hufanga, and you're not going to worry about it? Is that going to work 2 years in a row?
I just think part of building a good football team, more than the other sports, because you have so much turnover every year, is like when the Chiefs pivoted off. They didn't pivot. I mean, they just couldn't afford them. Ward comes to the Niners. What do? They draft heavy corners, right? They draft McDuffie. They end up drafting what's the USC transfer to Washington State? Watson.
Jalen.
They draft him. They drafted another player. I think they drafted 3 DBs last year. And by the second half of the season into the playoffs, like those guys are all making plays. And you just have to, the Niners have already done that with Lenore, with Ambry Thomas. They've done it with Hufanga. Like you kind of got to replenish. There's always a pivot. I mean, I would say when they signed Greenlaw last year, whenever that was in training camp or whatever, the writing was on the wall. Like, it's just kind of going to move forward with those two. When this guy hit free agency, Alshire was not going to be part of the conversation. So it's part of the puzzle of building the team. And I think as long as you have Fred, you feel pretty good, and you just invest heavily in the line of scrimmage. And that brings me to the other negative of like, under no circumstances could you, I'm glad they didn't do this a couple years ago. You couldn't extend Mike McGlinchey unless he gave you just some incredible, like, 3-year, $21 million deal, which clearly would have been one of the worst financial decisions in the history of mankind. He knew that.
And unpopular.
And do you think at $7 million a year would have been unpopular?
I think it would have been unpopular. Period.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Even if that's not fair.
3-year, $10 million. People would have had to like financials. Like, this just makes sense, right?
Yeah.
What is the number at 3 years that would have ever been like, okay, totally get it, makes sense, I can live with it?
Really, like 15 or 17, it might have felt that way. You just don't get consistent starting right tackles for that price, Johnny, because look at what it just cost them. Now, you would have said, they'd argue like at 25 million, it'd be a deal based on what he just got, right? But people would not have accepted that.
25, people would have been outraged. I think if you got closer to 10 and you just like, hey, look around the league, he's like the 30th paid right tackle, people would get it. But yeah, he was not high on the totem pole of likes and thumbs up with I mean, I would say he was the most polarizing player, like quarterback on the Niners pretty consistently.
Yeah. But again, the game's played in the arena, John, not on Twitter.
True. And he just got $50 million guaranteed. And within a year or two, you and I have both theorized, I think, not that people underestimate, but I think it's going to get ugly fast for McGlinchey. That's going to be a polarizing team. Russ has already taken arrows. Sean Payton is going to get a little leeway. He's not going to get blamed for this. Very quickly, Mike McGlinchey is going to play in some big games on national television. And it's like, people are already making fun of Russ. So, like, when Russ is getting sacked and it's coming from his side, it could get ugly quick, and we know how he reacts. But I don't want McGlinchey on this team if I'm John Lynch or Kyle Shanahan, obviously for the money. But you do have to fill the right tackle spot. And it even crossed my mind today in the shower. Stuff I think about. Like, Trent is almost 35. Now, he's still awesome, and every single good player in the Niners constantly says, I think he's the best football player like I've ever seen. He's definitely the best player on our team. But like, let's just say he's got 2 more elite years. He's under contract. Like, that's another thing you eventually got to figure out, like, how do you replace him? So you kind of got these 2 tackle positions, big picture, one in the immediate, and the other one is you're not going to suck. It's like, how do the Patriots ever get the number 1 pick? Well, as long as Bill Belichick's their coach, they're never going to win less than like 6 games. And honestly, it's probably going to be more like 7 or 8 every year. You're fucked. So it's like, as long as you have these star players, you're probably never, worst case scenario, you're winning like 8, 9 games. And you're never going to draft top 10 to get some sweet Trent Williams tackle. But like, who's just going to play right tackle this year? Can you get by with it and some of these randoms? Maybe. But maybe over the period of time, there is a little bit of a drop off.
Yeah. And who knows? I mean, it might be that, part of it is who's going to play left tackle after Trent Williams. Part of it the last couple of years has been somebody else at some point in the year has to play left tackle for Trent Williams. That has occurred, right? Like, as unsexy sometimes as O-line depth is, probably every team's fan base understands how important it is. But, if you watch the Niners every day for the last several years, you really understand how important offensive line depth is because they've played huge games. They played basically a playoff game without Trent Williams at left tackle 2 years ago. So it's a major part of who they are. Really, McGlinchey's been one of their most reliable pieces for several years, right? So for all of the negatives, that is what you're replacing, is a guy that you, for a lot of time, didn't have to worry about if who was starting at right tackle or not.
I think beside the year when Staley broke his leg and McGlinchey tore his ACL, it feels like McGlinchey started every single game. I mean, I could be wrong. He might have missed one with remember, didn't he have like a hamstring injury or something? But it feels like all reliable. He sure fucking played a lot, man. Now, it wasn't always pretty.
Played 8 games in 21, so he spent that year hurt.
Okay, so he got hurt in 19, hurt in 21.
Yeah, so that's 3 out of 5. It's 2 out of 5 years, so that's a lot. So
yeah, it is.
Maybe I'm misremembering a little.
He missed a game this year?
No.
And he was definitely hurt this year, so he played through injury. Like, the thing that was weird about McGlinchey, no one, I don't, he is a tough guy. If he has an injury where he can play, he's going to play. He is all in on the team. He's just a good guy to have on the team. But all that starts, once you get to price points, I think even a couple years ago, they knew, this is going to be, he's represented by Condon and his group, and Tom's now son runs it with Patrick Collins. The guys that, they represent Trey. They represent all the high price guys. They had to know, like real estate, it might be flawed, but it's a position where if you're just decent, you're fine. And the one thing he had going for him, which I think most people listen to this, most people that are negative on him do not give the pass on this or think that he's the reason for this, but it's he's a starter on a powerhouse team. Teams feel good about that. I saw Fitterer, the GM for Carolina, they signed Miles Sanders, Adam Thielen, and maybe Hayden Hurst, who he called a winner, but he originally started on the Ravens. They're we signed 3 guys that come from winning organizations, and that's a big that matters to us. So we get guys that come from places where the standard's high and they're used to going to the playoffs. And I would imagine that was Sean Payton goes, 1, we just need a right tackle, and 2, I get a guy who plays a lot of big games, knows what it's like, who's played in playoff games, a ton of them, starts in big games. Which you could argue, well, part of it is you can give me about 30 guys that we could have just replaced in that spot, and then we can make that argument. But that is an argument that's made.
I'll give you a positive, not big, kind of along your lines of not big name signings, but guys that could make an impact. And I would say specifically the one guy that I'm familiar with, Miles Hartsfield was the guy they just signed from Carolina, who Steve Wilks knows. Then they also signed Isaiah Oliver from the Falcons. And I think it's not, I'm trying to think what the best comp for him is. He compared himself to K'Wan Williams. But he's interesting in that he was coming off an ACL last year, right? So maybe you feel like you bought a little low on a guy that was a really high draft pick because he should be better this year than he was last year. He didn't start last season. He came back during the season from the ACL. But the one thing I remember about him, in specifically around the Pac-12, Colorado, Utah, those are 2 schools that have really stood out as having kind of the guys who Seattle's classic defenses physically would have liked, taller, long, really long-armed corners. And Isaiah Oliver is that. He's a really long-armed guy. And I wonder, I'd be curious, I haven't heard, if Steve Wilks had said something, I missed it. I don't think Steve has even talked, so I don't think he said anything. But I'd be curious if Steve Wilks liked him coming out of college or something like that. He was
where did he go to college?
Colorado, and was drafted. I think was he a 2nd-round pick? So
he played with Laviska, on some of those teams.
Yeah, I think he would have because he's young, 26.
Yeah.
So, well, I don't know. 2018 was his rookie year, so maybe he missed Laviska, but I think that's a good pickup. I think he probably has a high floor as a player. And you and I talked about this when they signed Steve Wilks. Just what position did a guy coach? He was a DB coach. So I think you should always have an eye on a coordinator who coached a particular position when they sign that position. I think Isaiah Oliver is going to be a good player for them this year.
I think one thing that, when I was in, these meetings and still talking to my buddies now about players, like why is this guy on the open market or why this guy gets snatched up so fast? It's like, if you're not going to be quote unquote a lock starter, like ultimately Charvarius Ward, what he does on special teams, irrelevant because he's not going to play him. But if I don't know you're going to start, do you bring anything else to the table? And if you're a lineman, you're not starting, you better be able to play multiple positions like we talked about earlier with Feliciano and McKivitz and these players over the years. If you're going to be a defensive back or a wide receiver and not start, like, can you cover kicks? Remember last year, like Danny Gray made a tackle. It's like, damn, didn't know he had that in the bag.
No.
It's like, okay. No wonder you're going to fucking dress every game.
Said a lot about him, I thought.
I would say Sherfield, you're going to look up, and Sherfield is going to have like a 12-year career. And it's going to be the majority of he's going to have a random touchdown here and there, but it's going to be a lot of special teams.
You see who you just signed with?
The Bills. And to me, he's a winning player. Sherfield could play for my team any day of the week. And it goes back, I remember when the Niners signed him and Larry Fitzgerald's like, I've loved this guy from the moment I met him. It's like, God, that's pretty impressive, personal reference. So like these type role players, they got to play on punt, on kickoff, and typically have to be physical guys. And I think the one thing I read about Oliver is like they feel pretty good about him on special teams. So like that's just one thing you're going to have to do. I need special teams bodies. And we've talked about like one reason the 49ers feels like have kind of sucked on special teams because obviously their starters are so physical, but it felt like, God, their special teams aren't that physical. Yeah. I do think the more and more Sherfield types you can get, Danny Gray's making big tackles, you can become more physical on special teams as a tackling unit. And it's harder to suck as bad as they were a couple years ago. And I wonder if part of it is like being low on those units. They even talk about that more. And that's like, let's face it, like once you're really diving into your special teams units, like how you're building your team, like you're pretty far along. Like Frank and those guys building the Colts, like we just need to, like, who's our starting units? I mean, that's stuff like good teams talk about, like the Chiefs talk about, the Bills are talking about, the Niners are talking about, the Eagles talk about. When you're starting the thing from the Cowboys should be talking about, if I'm Gannon and O.C. Mossenfort with the Cardinals, like let's just fucking try to get 22 decent starters, or the Texans. Like I'm not as consumed with like who's covering my punts. So that is something that like I would say on the margins could take the 49ers to the next level. Like you have a top 10 cover unit.
Yeah.
Which would be the most unheard of thing in the Kyle Shanahan era.
Yeah. I mean, I think if even I could pull up the PFF numbers.
Was a point of difference for Harbaugh.
It was, but he did it with a very specific formula. He played his best players on special teams. So, are they willing to do that?
One thing that I found pretty interesting is like the Eagles kind of ran it back, right? They rolled back Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox. They re-signed both their corners. Most of their guys are under contract. That, you could argue like they had the two corners last year. And, according to Ayuk and Debo, they weren't exactly covering everybody. But the one thing you could not dispute if we were nitpicking the defense, their defensive line was dominant. And they just lost 11 and a half sacks. And there's a decent chance that their ages, Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox, are going the wrong way. So if they got they're still going to be awesome, right? Because their offense, last year, they drafted in the second round a center guard. I think he's from Iowa. I forget where he's from, but he was really good. Maybe Minnesota. And they just lost a guard to Pittsburgh, Isaac Seumalo, and he got a plug and play like they did a year before with Landon Dickerson. Boom, Brandon Brooks retires, plug and play. They always draft offensive linemen and plug and play. Kelsey's coming back. Their offense is going to be loaded. But if their defense is just incrementally a little worse from a pass rushing standpoint, maybe they aren't just some lock 14-15 win team and it's more like 12. I would say the Cowboys, and this to me is a negative for the 49ers in the sense of like Eagles get a little worse, but they were already better than you. Did the Cowboys get a little better? Like added Brandon Cooks, like I Googled his football reference. I was like, he's been a little more productive than I think most people think. You put him there with Lamb, you get rid of Zeke, so there's not a little hanging over their head. They keep Pollard. their offense should be pretty explosive. And defensively, like that was kind of what they hung their hat on last year, right? Their coach is back, the defensive coordinator, which is basically like their second head coach because it's not like Mike has anything to do with it. Micah, you could argue, like Bosa, could even take another step and be defensive player of the year level guy. I mean, he was this year, but like usually it's happened with Nick, it happened with Khalil Mack. That third year for a guy like you're headed a Hall of Fame career, you just become fucking dominant.
Well, and McCarthy took over play calling duty. I think Breer tweeted he's not. I think
Could that be worse or better?
Yeah,
their offense has been pretty good, I guess.
Yeah, they traded for Stephon Gilmore too. Don't forget that. So they got more talented. I saw a stat. It's like the 10th straight year they've acquired somebody else's former first round pick or a first round pick. The Cowboys.
That's like the Al Davis.
But it counts like 2020. They got Alton Smith, which I'd forgotten about. When it was good for them. Remember that?
That's moments, yeah.
They get like multiple former first rounders every year.
Amari.
But yeah, they're more talented. I mean, I think Dallas has probably upgraded its talent. While we were talking, somebody in the chat said that Dalton Schultz signed with the Texans. But now I do think
look at
Dallas,
he had 570 yards. He's not like
he banked on him. He played on the tag instead of he had like a 3-year, $30 million offer. I don't know what he signed with the Texans for, but
that backfired.
They did. But the one thing with Dallas is I don't think they can. I don't think they can win a championship with their coach. But whatever. Doesn't mean they can't.
There's difference in winning a Super. Yeah.
I mean, they could have. Tony Pollard got hurt last year, and it came down to the very end of the game. So you got to put them away.
I think there's a clear big three in the NFC, and then it's just I do not put the Giants there by any means. I think the Niners, Cowboys, and Eagles. I think you're looking at 3 teams that expect to get the number 1 seed. Like I think that internally in those buildings, like the goal is like we're gonna have the first round bye. I mean, is there any other team that can really?
Green Bay used to be. They're not. Does New Orleans think they can get there? Maybe, but they're not in that group of teams that we just talked about.
If they actually come together, they could benefit. Like, what if their division just sucks, so they get 3-6-0
for sure? But I mean, they won 7 games last year. Their quarterbacks played 1 playoff game, so they're just not in the class that of teams we just talked about. Now, they'd be like, well, the Niners are banking on who to play quarterback.
But there's a big difference of going like, are they going to go from 7 to 12 or more likely go 7 to 10?
Yeah, Tampa's out of it. The Giants, no. Seattle, no. So that's the group.
There's a lot of
Rams, healthy Rams.
What about Dan Campbell Lions?
No,
they got a top 10 pick.
No,
they have their own pick.
No,
I'm not talking number 1 seed. I'm thinking.
Oh.
I saw.
I
heard someone say, or maybe I read, they are the betting favorite right now to win the division. Which they are. They're going to be fascinating, right? Because everyone's going to pick them to make the playoffs.
Yeah.
How do they handle that?
They can't play us against the world anymore.
Did
they lose their running back? Was it Jamal Williams? Did he resign?
No, he went with Derek to the Saints.
I mean, he's like a heart. He was like, we remember Harden. Like he's one of the hearts of that team.
Yeah. Only cost like a couple $1 million too.
Wow. So I mean, Rams are a team that we're not mentioning that if in the end they're like around.
One thing they could do, because they have 2 picks, most people think the Texas running back is like, of the last like 20 years, like one of the better prospects, like Adrian Peterson, just an all-time like legit prospect coming up. What if it's like they got Bijan Robinson on the Rams, or I mean on the Lions?
I'm not buying Jared Goff's taking you to a 1 seed.
Again, I'm not talking necessarily 1 seed.
Win their division.
I'm talking more.
Yeah. I'm buying.
I think they could make an argument if Goff continues just to play solid, their talent on their roster, that they are the clear tier of Eagles, Niners, Cowboys, and then they're right there. They're more talented than the Giants. That their coach, we'll see. Everyone's acting like Ben Johnson, the coordinator they had, is like the next fucking Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay. We'll see. The pressure's on them, but talent-wise, they are. I mean, they have a top, 6th, 7th pick from the Rams. I think Seattle's got 5. Seattle's got 7. Maybe they got 5.
It's 6.
Eagles
Seattle has
10?
5. Raiders have 7. It's their own pick.
Was that a shot?
No. I'm just having fun. Are you surprised Adam Thielen didn't go to a good team?
Look at his numbers. I mean, they've kind of been diminished. He's
Yeah.
old. He's older. Not very fast. I think he did the J.J. Watt of I wonder if anyone was in remotely close to the money that $14 million guaranteed.
Yeah.
I can see a lot of good teams like, hey, man,
We'd love to have you for 6.
Chiefs, Bills, whoever, like Seattle, like, hey, we'll give you 4 guaranteed, incentives up to like 8, 9, 14 million. I wonder if there was really a market for that. That's a lot of money to give a guy that I've always respected him, but it didn't feel like they hesitated cutting. Obviously, financially, they got in a weird spot, but you just get to the point when you're an older player and it's double the money. It's like not even a question. You're like, the Bills want me. They're offering 6. It's like, bro, you could win a Super Bowl. You're already really rich, or you just can't turn down $14 million.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Bills are the team that made a lot of sense for him, but if you're going to make twice as much money in what could be one of the last 2 or 3 years of your career, who knows? Maybe you think Bryce Young's good. I don't know.
But don't you think a lot of good teams, I'd be shocked if like the Chiefs didn't sniff around, not for much money, the Giants, like offensive coaches that are, we plan on going to the playoffs. You'll get your catches and get your touchdowns. Or it's just one of those. Remember, Jordy Nelson came to the Raiders. Like you get a number that's a lot higher than everybody else, and then you just head off to the sunset. Jordy was rough.
Jordy felt like was past where Thielen is right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Thielen's a better player right now than Jordy Nelson was. Did Jordy go back to the Packers for you after that? I remember watching him thinking like his career's over, and then did he get another year?
I don't think
Raiders had a few players like that where you're like, it is all over for Matt Schaub, and then he plays like 4 more years. No, he ended with the Raiders. All right.
I think it was like a hard end, right? That was it.
You mean like didn't go to a camp the next year?
I'm just saying like he just played 1 season for the Raiders, right? And his career over.
Yeah. One and done. But I mean, he had 97. Like it's funny in the NFL how fast he had 97 catches, 1,000 yards, 14 touchdowns in 2016. So after the 2016 season, Jordy Nelson is living large. 2 years later, he's out of the league after playing for the Raiders.
Well, if you meet someone in the NFL and they just had 14 touchdowns and you go, how much longer do you think your career's got? Do you think they're selling stock on themselves?
Hell no.
I had 14 fucking touchdowns in a 6. So, basically average what, like 0.85 touchdowns a game in 2016? He was scoring basically every game on average. There's only 16 games.
Yeah.
I'm sure the Packers were probably decent that year, so he's on one of the better teams in the league. And it's just over. That's where Aaron wants these guys to get some respect on their way out. He's not asking for much. He's asking for say thank you. It happens. It's more tangible, I think, with offensive players like running backs, tight ends, and receivers. Because, damn, he had 80 catches, and then a year later he's cut out of the league. Where it's like defensive players, it's hard to it's probably more tape based. Like this corner can't run anymore.
It felt like Navarro had an end like that though.
Navarro had a incredibly quick thrown off the bridge ending to his career.
Because remember, it was like
not crazy when you really talk it out though. Devastating knee, take him 2 hours to get ready for practice.
Yeah.
Speed completely gone. You could argue it was just when his leg snapped, it was just trended. Nowhere near what he once was.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't Kyle basically put him out to pasture?
Yeah, but he played for the Niners that year, and then
he got caught a couple years.
Well,
he got caught a couple games into the season, right?
Yeah, 16 he came back, played 4, then he played 5 games in 17, and then played 10 for the Raiders that same year.
Oh yeah, Del Rio and Reggie.
But Man, he had 154 tackles in 15. Chris Borland had a quick ending. Well, didn't Chris Borland? He retired, right?
Yeah,
Concussions.
one and done.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to add here?
Chris Borland was like the Chet Holmgren of middle linebackers.
Chet, man. That wasn't even. I'd forgotten. Were you and I talking about Chet the other day?
I don't.
I was texting with somebody about Chet. Just like he wasn't. It wasn't even. I don't think it was summer league. It was like Drew League.
Yeah, well, right. It was that LeBron
It was
game.
He was playing with LeBron. Yeah.
Yeah.
God. UCLA Gonzaga Thursday night. Good game.
8 straight Sweet 16s for Gonzaga.
I thought it was more. Is it not more? I thought
there might have been a gap. I thought Timmy said 8. That we were coming into this game 7 straight. We refused. We didn't want to be the team. Are they more impressive than Boise State?
Football's so much harder, I think, to get where Boise got, but Gonzaga is a big boy. Like, they've been to 2 national championship games. Think about that. Like, Boise never sniffed a national championship game.
You'd say Gonzaga is clearly like a top 6-7 program in the country currently, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So if you lose in the third, I guess
they're never playing in the play-in, right?
No. Yeah, but I'm just confused. What does third round mean? I've always won. Yeah. Okay. So 8 years at the Sweet 16, but they've won a game every year going back. They haven't been one and done since 2010 when they were the. Oh no, they won that year too. God, I mean, they just win all the time.
Yeah, he's done a pretty good job.
So they haven't lost in the second round since 2010.
Have you seen the line on UCLA?
UCLA is like a 2.5-point favorite, I believe.
Would you say that's in your mind, is that a coin flip game?
Yes.
Do you think UCLA has an edge?
Well, considering I told you that I didn't hate your Arizona that a national championship round pick, I think it's a pretty even game. Yeah.
I did put $200 on Gonzaga to win the whole thing, so I'm all in. Do you think Gonzaga is? Are they the best? You know, because Mick hasn't been there that long. Obviously, UCLA is rolling now. You know, Arizona, they've had a couple moments, but they're still the gap what they once were under Lute. They're still one of the best programs. But is Gonzaga the number 1 program on the West Coast for basketball right now? Would you put UCLA ahead of them? Just name recognition's bigger, but like,
I mean, if they
haven't lost a game.
If you're saying like the last 10 years, who's just had the best run, it's absolutely Gonzaga. If you're saying all 3 jobs are open, what job would the best coach take?
Well, I think Gonzaga would be third.
Yeah.
Right? I think Arizona would easily get.
Well, if you're Gonzaga, you'd argue like, well, just come here. You're going to go to the tournament every year. You're going to roll through your regular season as the number 1 offense in the country, you know.
Well, like UCLA's proven, right? Their program is bigger than their coach for the most part, right? Like Howland going to Final Fours. Alford was nitpicked, but he was pretty successful.
Elite Eights, yeah.
Mick Cronin's kicking ass and taking names. Arizona, we can nitpick some of their early exits. Elite program, bunch of different coaches. Is Gonzaga just the coach?
Oh, after Mark Few, yeah, good question.
You know, I mean,
you'd have to say all we know now is it's the coach. That's all we know right now.
Like Boise clearly is a high-end football program. I would say the peak of them is Chris Peterson, and it's just not as good without him.
It's not been the same without him.
Still good, still very competitive and impressive, but like, you know, whenever Mark Few retires, like let's just say he wins the national championship this year, wins it, and just like, I'm fucking out. And just, I'm going out on top.
Yeah.
Because part of my logic betting on them was like, you know, the last couple of years because of Suggs and Holmgren, there was a lot of pressure on them, right? 2 years ago, they answered the bell and they got to the Natty and they got worked, but that was pretty incredible. Like, that's pretty good, getting to the national championship. Last year felt like even more pressure because it was like, this is the year they're going to win it. Did Arkansas knock them out? Whoever got knocked them out kind of in the Elite Eight or the Sweet 16, it was kind of like, holy shit. And they just kind of got worked. I think it might have been Musselman in the Sweet 16. And then this year, I don't watch them. I just know Timmy's on the team, but it's like it feels like they're flying under the radar. And then I remember like halftime flipping on the WCC game against St. Mary's. Now, clearly, St. Mary's and Gonzaga, there's a gap between the two programs, but they beat the fucking piss out of them. And I'm like, I think this team, the previous years are like a 5-6-1 team to win it. And then I look at the odds, they're 15-1. I'm like, this team, all the returning guys, they got one of the best players in the tournament. They got a coach who can beat anybody. If this was Kentucky or, Duke with the same kind of group, they would get much more respect. And if they beat UCLA, they're going, I think.
To the Final Four, to the national championship.
To the Final Four. They play the winner of UConn, Arkansas, and Arkansas is a little down this year.
Yeah, you don't have to. This is not the best team they've had, but that doesn't matter. You just have to be better than the other teams in your bracket. And this whole thing is pretty wacky this year. I think
Kansas won it last year. It's not Self's best team, right?
Right. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It feels like they're due. First of all, they've been to a lot of these, and Drew Timmy's one of the greatest. It turns out most prolific tournament players ever. Right? He joined the list of like a handful of guys who've had 9 20-point games in the NCAA tournament last night and was dominant. If they beat UCLA, I think it'll say a lot about them too, because they are, like, in terms of how you play, opposites. They score like 84. They score a ton of points. And UCLA doesn't win games in the 80s. They don't even play them. So it's a great kind of test for them. If they win the game, it'll say like, we can play either style.
I think it's setting up for them. And again, they could easily lose, and all this, what I'm saying, is irrelevant. That TCU game, it feels like, was one of the better games so far in the tournament. Just high level. You beat UCLA, which is always an incredible moment for a program when they're good and you're good, and West Coast teams. What if you get Musbus, who, I saw someone in the chat, did kick his ass last year. You get a revenge tour, beat them, and then you go to the Final Four playing sweet teams. I mean, you got to beat like Alabama and fucking Houston. I mean, it would be hard. But be his moment.
It would be. It feels like he deserves it. To finish here, Mo says, Guy and John, the Eagles were 1-4 or 1-5 with Sirianni calling plays. Now they lost their play caller to the Colts. This is a legitimate take. Their season changed when Nick Sirianni stopped calling plays for them in 2021. So there is a question about what comes next for Philly. Now they promoted a guy, right?
Utah quarterback.
Oh, Brian Johnson, who a lot of people really have liked for several years. He's kind of been a hot name. So maybe they'll be fine. It's not going back to Sirianni. But yeah, that's a legitimate point about it's a question that Philly has to answer.
And they haven't said yet, it's like, well, so is Brian Johnson taking, because it's one thing to be the offensive coordinator, right? There are a lot of them throughout the league. Slowick was last year. McDaniel was the year before. LaFleur's been it. You're the offensive coordinator. A lot of guys have been it for McVay. Well, if you're not calling the plays, I think we too liberally throw around that term without like, well, he's not calling the plays. No, he's like an assistant coach that helps with the game plan while the other guy calls the plays.
Yeah.
Is Brian Johnson calling the plays? Because Brian Johnson, I'd forgotten this, but for a long, Dak Prescott, Mississippi State, and then he was a Mullen guy. Like once he left Utah, he transitioned to like Dan Mullen, who before everyone started making fun of him 2 years ago, I'd say Dan Mullen was considered one of the better offensive play callers and offensive minds in college football. So I would guess Brian Johnson's calling the plays.
I would too. And here's why. If you're Sirianni, you can't lose play calling duties twice as the head coach.
He gave them of himself, though.
According to who? You know what I mean? The only way Sirianni can call plays is A, if they're just up Schitt's Creek without a paddle on play caller, or B, you just know, like your job's on the line and you have to do it to save your job, to prove that you can do it. But you cannot remain a head coach of a team in which they've taken play calling duties from you twice in a 3-year span. You just can't do it. So you have to let Brian Johnson start as the play caller.
Do you think next year more people, and obviously this doesn't matter, but I just mean general consensus, people that cover the league, talk about the league, most people that aren't like biased toward either side will pick the Eagles to be the best team in the NFC over the Niners and the Cowboys?
Yes.
So by far, for sure, right? They got the quarterback coming back. they are going to have dramatically. I mean, they had pressure this year once they entered as the season went on, the pressure, but start to finish, like the bullseye, they're going to be treated like the Chiefs. Like,
yeah, well, not quite. I think it's going to be, if I had to split it up, I'd say it's going to be like 45% to 50% Eagles, 30 to 35% Niners, and then whatever that leaves over. I even think like 20% would be too high for Dallas. 15%. I don't see how. I don't see how.
yeah, a couple rogue guys picking the Lions or something.
Yeah, exactly. And
Giants.
and Dallas isn't. There's like 15% left over from Eagles Niners, and 8 of that goes to the Cowboys. But
not counting former Cowboy players, employees. Like
Irvin,
Jason Garrett on NBC and like Michael.
Has the Irvin tape been released yet?
It feels
I saw
like
his lawyers the other day said they were going to release it, and I was like, "Oh, I can't wait for the lawyers to release it." And then I stopped. I didn't follow the story that day.
No, I haven't. I saw is he suing for $500 million or something? Michael Irvin.
Oh yeah, he's suing. Is it Marriott? Somebody
Marriott.
for a lot.
Listen, I can't speak to his situation. I'm a loyal Marriott guy. Have been for a decade. Great point system.
Can they pay him in points, you think? Would you settle a lawsuit in points with an airline or a hotel?
Ultimately, you were just sent home if you didn't lose your job. If they came to you and said, unlimited points, nicest hotels, whenever, wherever you want, moving forward the rest of your life.
That's your life.
Is that a pretty good deal?
It is, but like 50 or whatever million is better, because ideally you'd want to take their money and then spend it somewhere else.
Would you double dip? Would you be like, listen, it's like a negotiation. I won't make you pay me 50. You pay me 30, and I get unlimited points to the 5. Not like the Spring Hill Suites, but like any JW, anywhere I'm going, I get unlimited minimum. If I want like 3 rooms, not just 1 room, like want my friends, my family, kids.
But what if you are so rich and the best hotel in town is like, the Mandarin Oriental, like one of these places. And you're like, well, I'm staying at I feel obligated to stay at the JW because it's on points. Like, you don't want to do that,
True. I don't know. You're the only one on this podcast that stayed at a 4 Seasons. So I don't even know the nicest hotel I've ever stayed at.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to stay anywhere else after, but I've only stayed other places after. All right. On that note, thanks for hanging.
Would you say it's that incredible at a 4 Seasons?
I mean, it was great. Yeah, it was great. But you can have a great hotel experience not at a 4 Seasons, I think. Yeah. But I think there's a level of service that that comes with it that you probably become accustomed to,
Yeah.
And it did have a TV in the shower or bathtub or
that's hard to be.
Like in the mirror, in the bathroom mirror. You didn't even know it was there.
Touchscreen, or like do you have to like change
No, I don't remember how it was controlled. It was just in the glass. But
so if you ask Joe, like once you start, that's MIDDLEKAUFF who paid for Haberman's 4 Seasons. Once you start staying at 4 Seasons, you probably never go back to even like the next tier down, huh?
Yeah, that's where like the NFLPA players thing, It's like if you played on a team where everybody had their own like first class seat, and then you play on a team where you're sharing legroom with the trainer, I give you you're allowed to complain about that. Like I get it,
Yeah, I mean there's a reason, right? The Major League Baseball teams that are playing the Oakland Athletics stay in downtown San Francisco because they only have the 2 suite hotels.
Yeah, they stay at the St. Regis or the Sir Francis Drake.
Remember Shaq famously once on TNT postgame didn't know at the time the Warriors played in Oracle because they always stayed at the 4 Seasons.
Yeah, that's right.
He was shocked. He was dead serious. And
it's all timer.
Everyone thought like he's no. It actually makes sense if you're not
get on the bus. You don't really know the geography. Yeah. Not paying attention.
Yeah. Makes sense.
All right, later, y'all.
Later.